Welcome. Let your mind settle and allow the noise of the day to fade. We are finding ourselves in a quiet, spacious room. The air is still, carrying the scent of drying ink and seasoned wood. We are in Nanjing, the capital of the Ming dynasty, and the year is 1403. A new emperor, the Mongol emperor, has taken the throne. His reign is new, and like many new rulers, he feels the weight of legitimacy, the need to announce his presence, not with force, but with presence itself. He envisions a grand display, a gesture that will ripple across the known world. In the quiet of the imperial workshops, drafts are being drawn. This is not a plan for war. It is a plan for a fleet larger than any the world has ever seen. Its purpose is not conquest, but diplomacy. The mandate, written on silken scrolls, is simple: to proceed all the way to the end of the earth, to unify all within the four seas. The goal is to bring emissaries to China, not to send armies out. It is a project of immense scale, born from a quiet, imperial ambition. Now let's begin our journey. Settle in, and let your mind drift. The emperor's vision, set down in ink, now had to be rendered in timber. The work began not in the capital itself, but at the Longjiang shipyards, near Nanjing, along the banks of the broad Yangtze River. Here, the air became a dense mixture of river mud, pine resin, and the sharp scent of tung oil used to waterproof the hulls. When we examine the archaeological records of the shipyard, we find slipways, the gentle slopes leading to the water, large enough to accommodate vessels of a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The primary sources, such as the history of Ming, list dimensions for the largest of these vessels, the Baochuan, or treasure ships, that are staggering. They record them as being over 400 chi long, which translates to perhaps 440 feet. To a mind accustomed to European shipbuilding of the same period, this number seems almost mythical. A ship of that era from Portugal or Spain might have been 70 or 80 feet long. The treasure ships, as recorded, were floating structures, longer than a modern football field. But their design was not for speed. It was for stability, for presence, and for carrying capacity. The sound of the shipyards would have been a constant, rhythmic percussion. The heavy, dull impact of mallets striking chisels, the scraping of saws pulled by teams of men through enormous trunks of teak and camphor wood, and the calls of the foreman, coordinating the slow, difficult work. The skeletons of these great ships rose from the ground, their hulls built with a uniquely Chinese innovation: watertight compartments. The records show the hulls were divided, so that if one section was breached, the ship would not founder. It was a design of profound practicality. These Baochuan were the flagships, but they were not alone. The scale of the fleet, as detailed in the imperial manifests, was not in one ship, but in the entirety of the flotilla. The first voyage, which began to gather in 1405, consisted of over 300 vessels. We can see the meticulous planning when we break down the fleet's composition, as listed in the court records. There were the horse ships, the Machuan, which were built with wide decks and ramps, designed to carry horses and other large animals given as tribute, or perhaps traded. There were the Liangchuan, the supply ships, their holds filled to capacity with measures of rice, wheat, and dried beans. We find the Zuochuan, the troop transports, which carried the bulk of the 27,080 men listed on the roster. And perhaps most critically, the Shuichuan, the water tankers. These were ships designed for one purpose: to carry vast quantities of fresh water in deep, lacquered wooden tanks, ensuring the fleet could survive long passages at sea. This number, over 27,000 individuals, is also worth a quiet examination. The manifests reveal this was not an army of invasion. Rather, it was a floating city, a complete cross-section of Ming society designed for self-sufficiency. The roles list physicians and herbalists, astronomers responsible for navigation, and geomancers. They list shipwrights and carpenters, carrying their tools, ready to repair any damage from storms or groundings. They list sailmakers, caulkers, and blacksmiths, and, crucially, they list translators. Men who spoke Arabic and Persian, whose role was not combat, but communication. This detail, found in the administrative records, reinforces the mission's mandate. It was a diplomatic undertaking. The cargo holds themselves were a mirror of the empire's wealth, not gold, which was not the primary currency of tribute, but commodities of immense value. The ledgers list thousands upon thousands of bolts of silk in deep reds, brilliant blues, and imperial yellows. They list porcelain, delicate, thin-walled bowls and vases, packed carefully in rice straw, products of the imperial kilns at Jing. These were not just trade goods, they were gifts, symbols of a sophisticated culture, tangible proof of the Ming dynasty's mandate of heaven. At the head of this vast, complex operation was one man. His name was Zheng He. The historical records provide a clear picture of him. He was not from the traditional scholar official class. He was a court eunuch, and he was a Muslim. Born in the inland province of Yunnan, he had, as a young man, been taken into the court of the prince who would become the Mongol emperor. He was a trusted advisor, a man who understood the languages and customs of the lands of the Western Ocean, the lands of the Indian Ocean, many of which shared his faith. His selection as admiral was a deliberate, strategic choice. His role was not that of a conqueror, but of a chief emissary, a logistician of the highest order. The method of navigation for such a fleet is a study in quiet confidence. The ship's masters did not sail into the unknown. They possessed charts. Later collections like the Mao Kun map are believed to be derived from the navigational charts used by Zheng He's fleet. These are not maps as we might picture them, with continents drawn to scale. Instead, they are zhenjing, or needle paths. When we study these charts, we find a long, continuous scroll. It shows a route, a line, with instructions. The primary tool was the Chinese wet compass, a magnetized needle floating in a bowl of water, marked with 24 or 48 distinct points of direction. The sailing instructions, as recorded, are beautifully monotonous. A hypothetical but typical instruction might read, "From the port at Liujiagang, steer 240 degrees for 10 watches." A watch was a unit of time, measured by the slow, steady burning of a calibrated incense stick. Navigation was a matter of time, direction, and depth. The charts are dotted with notes on soundings, the depth of the water, measured by dropping a weighted line. And they used the stars. In the northern hemisphere, the navigators measured the height of Polaris, the North Star, above the horizon, using their fingers, or small pieces of wood, to determine their latitude. In the summer of 1405, this fleet, this floating city, assembled at Liujiagang, a port near Suzhou, on the mouth of the Yangtze River. The northeast monsoon, the seasonal wind, had not yet begun. They waited. The preparations were final. Fresh water tanks were topped. The last of the silks were loaded. The mood we can infer from the lack of any dramatic record was not one of fear, but of process. Then, as the autumn winds began to shift, the signal was given. We can imagine the sound, not of trumpets, but of low-pitched gongs. The creak of the windlasses as the enormous iron and wood anchors were hauled up. And then, the sound of the sails. The treasure ships reputedly had 9 masts, rigged with red silk sails. The sight of them, unfurling one by one, catching the first of the northeast monsoon, would have been a slow, deliberate blossoming of crimson against the gray river water. The fleet did not dash into the ocean. It moved with the slow, powerful current of the Yangtze, passing the Chongming sandbars and out into the East China Sea. The ships were designed to ride with the wind. The plan was not to fight the sea, but to use its rhythms. The northeast monsoon, which blows steadily from November to February, would push them south. They sailed down the coast of China, a massive, orderly procession. Their first stop was Champa, in what is now southern Vietnam. From there, they would wait for the winds to shift again, to carry them across the South China Sea, toward the critical passage of the Malacca Strait and into the Indian Ocean. The first leg of the journey was complete, a successful execution of logistics, a testament to the power of methodical, patient navigation. Having navigated the Malacca Strait, the Great Fleet entered the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. This was not an unknown sea. It was the Western Ocean, a well-understood and ancient basin of commerce, guided by the predictable rhythm of the monsoons. The fleet, having left port with the winter northeast monsoon at its back, sailed a steady, reliable course. The journey across the ocean was a long, slow passage, marked by the daily routines of the 27,000 men aboard. The measuring of time by incense sticks, the nightly plotting of the stars, the maintenance of the rigging, and the careful rationing of water from the Sichuan. Their primary destination was Calicut, on the Malabar coast of modern-day India. Calicut was not a quiet outpost. It was perhaps the greatest international emporium on Earth at that time. It was a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from Cairo, Aden, and Hormuz met traders from the distant Spice Islands. The fleet was not discovering this place. It was making a formal, imperial appearance at the center of the known trading world. As the ships approached the coast, the first sensation would have been the smell. After weeks of open ocean, the land brought the scent of damp earth, coconut husk fires, and the sharp, unmistakable aroma of spices, pepper, cardamom, and ginger that permeated the air of the Malabar coast. The city itself, when it came into view, would have been a low, sprawling settlement, nestled against a backdrop of dense palm groves. The sound of the ocean surf a constant, low roar. Because of their immense size, the Baochuan could not enter the shallow harbor. The records note they anchored far offshore, a floating, 9-masted testament to Ming power, visible for miles. The diplomatic process began with methodical, unhurried precision. Our most valuable guide for this process is Ma Huan. He was the translator, a man fluent in Arabic and Persian, who served as the eyes and ears of the admiral. He kept a detailed journal, the Ying Ya Shenglen, or the overall survey of the ocean's shores. When we read his account, we find not a story of confrontation, but a quiet, procedural narrative. The admiral, Zheng He, and his immediate staff, including Ma Huan, would transfer to smaller local boats to be ferried ashore. They were met on the beach not by the king, the Zamoran, but by his chief officials. Ma Huan notes the welcome was formal. A procession was formed, and the Chinese delegation was escorted, slowly, through the bustling, narrow streets of the city to the Zamoran's court. Here, the diplomatic ritual, the core of the mission, was enacted. The Chinese presented their credentials and, most importantly, the gifts from the Mongol emperor. We must understand these were not trade items. They were a formal presentation of the superior Ming culture. The manifests list bolts of embroidered silk, fine porcelain vases and bowls, and silver. These were laid before the Zamoran as a gesture of the emperor's magnanimity, an invitation to participate in the Ming tributary system. The Zamoran, a sophisticated ruler well accustomed to foreign dignitaries, would then, in turn, offer his own gifts. The local records of Calicut show a deep understanding of this exchange. The return gifts would be local products of high value, pearls, fine cotton textiles, and above all, pepper. This ceremonial exchange, which Ma Huan records with ethnographic detail, established the relationship. It was a performance of mutual respect, a piece of state theater. Only after these rituals were complete could the trade begin. Ma Huan provides a wonderfully mundane, step-by-step description of the process, which reveals a highly organized and low-stakes system. The Zamoran's officials would grant the Chinese a pandan, a large walled warehouse compound near the beach. This became their base of operations. The next step, Ma Huan writes, was the striking of hands. On an appointed day, the chief Chinese envoys, including Zheng He, would meet with the Zamoran's chief trade official and the Chedi, the local merchant brokers. The price for a key commodity, like pepper, would be discussed. There was no haggling, but a formal declaration. Once a price was agreed, Ma Huan records, they strike hands, and the price is fixed. From that moment, no one from the Chinese side or the local side could alter that price for the season. This act established a predictable, stable, and calm market, free of volatility. With the price set, the mundane, logistical work began. The Chinese officials and accountants would move into their warehouse. The doors were opened. For weeks, a slow, steady stream of local merchants, large and small, would arrive. They brought their goods. The primary commodity was pepper. It grew in abundance on the hillsides of the Malabar coast. It was brought in sacks, weighed on large scales by Chinese and local officials, and checked for quality. But the ledgers, as described, show much more. We find entries for cardamom, cloves, and ginger. We find precious stones, particularly coral beads and pearls, which were highly valued. We find records of puchuk, a medicinal root, and camphor. The warehouse would have been a place of quiet, focused activity. The scent of the spices would have been almost overwhelming. The sound would have been the clinking of scales, the murmur of the accountants comparing their ledgers, and the rustle of commodities being measured and packed. Ma Huan, as a Muslim, also took time to observe the people of Calicut. His tone is that of an objective ethnographer. He notes their appearance. The men wrap a cloth around their loins. The women also wrap a cloth. He describes their complex caste system without judgment. He observes their diet, noting the centrality of rice, fish, and coconut. He describes the local mathematics, noting they used a system of finger signs for private trade, a silent language of commerce. He also notes the religious landscape. As a Muslim, he would have been comfortable. Arab merchants had been a dominant presence in Calicut for centuries, and the Zamoran's court was famously tolerant. Ma Huan records the presence of 20 or 30 mosques in the city. He also observes the majority Hindu practices, describing the temples and the reverence for cattle with a simple, factual curiosity. This period in Calicut was not brief. The fleet was entirely dependent on the monsoon winds. Having arrived on the northeast monsoon, they had to wait for the winds to reverse. This meant a stay of several months, from perhaps December until the following spring. This long enforced layover was not a time of tension. It was a time of repair, of diplomacy, and of systematic trade. The shipwrights would have been busy, recalking hulls and mending sails. The physicians would have foraged for local herbs. The water tankers would have been refilled from local wells. As the time for departure neared, the cargo holds, once filled with porcelain and silk, were now heavy with the wealth of India. The primary cargo was pepper, tons of it, its pungent dust settling over everything. The final ledgers were balanced. The accountants, using their abacuses, would have reconciled the silver and goods exchanged. Zheng He would have undertaken a final, formal audience with the Zamoran, a ceremony of farewell. Then, when the astronomers confirmed the winds had shifted, blowing steadily from the southwest, the signal would be given. The fleet, now laden with its new cargo, would haul up its anchors. The 9-masted ships would slowly turn, their red silk sails catching the new monsoon, beginning the long, slow, and methodical passage back toward China. The routes to Calicut and Southeast Asia were now well established, entered into the ship's logs as needle paths. The first 3 voyages had been a profound success, bringing back emissaries and tribute, confirming the power of the Mongol emperor. But the maps in the palace and the stories from the Arab traders in Calicut spoke of lands even further west, They spoke of Hormuz, the great pearl market in the Persian Gulf, and beyond that, the fabled, wealthy coast of Africa. And so, the mandate was extended. The later voyages, beginning with the fourth in 1413, were tasked with stretching the fleet's reach across the entire Indian Ocean. From Calicut, the great ships, having waited once again for the favorable shift in the monsoon, would weigh anchor and set their course west across the Arabian Sea. This was a long and open passage, navigated by the stars and the compass. Their destination was Hormuz, an island city situated at the narrow mouth of the Persian Gulf. When we read Ma Huan's account of Hormuz, the sensory texture of his writing shifts. He leaves the lush, damp, spice-laden air of the Malabar coast and describes an entirely different world. Hormuz, he writes, was built on a barren island of salt and rock. The heat was profound, excessively hot, he notes. The houses were built of stone, and the people, he observed, were wealthy. This was a city of pure commerce. It produced nothing but trade. He describes the marketplace, not with the aroma of spices, but with the dry scent of dust and the faint, saline smell of the pearl fisheries. The Chinese arrived, as they did in Calicut, as a state delegation. They presented their silks and porcelains. In return, Ma Huan's ledgers note the items offered by the ruler of Hormuz: pearls of exceptional quality, precious stones, and, most prized by the Ming court, strong, magnificent horses from Arabia and Persia. The horse ships, the Machuan, were loaded with these valuable animals for the long journey home. But from these hubs, from Hormuz, or from Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, the fleet could now reach for the African continent. They would have taken on local pilots, mu'allims, men who knew the winds and currents of the Swahili coast. The fleet sailed south, following the coastline, a journey of many weeks. Their first major African landfall, as recorded by Ma Huan, was Mogadishu, in modern-day Somalia. This was a powerful, established city-state. Ma Huan's tone, when we read his journal, is one of objective observation. He describes a city of stone-built houses, 4 or 5 stories high. He notes the people are overbearing, and that their diet consists of millet, fish, and camel's milk. The reception here was not as immediately placid as in Calicut. The local sultan was wary of this enormous, unknown fleet. The historical record indicates a brief, low-stakes show of force. The treasure ships, which were armed with cannon, were ordered to fire a demonstration, what Ma Huan calls exploding firebombs. It was not an attack, but a display of sound and smoke, a piece of technological theater. The records note that after this demonstration, the people were frightened and then sought reconciliation. Calm was restored, negotiations began, and the process of formal diplomatic trade was opened. But the true diplomatic success on the African continent came further south, at the port of Malindi, in modern-day Kenya. Here, the reception was entirely different. The ruler of Malindi, perhaps hearing of the fleet's power, or perhaps seeing the immense opportunity it represented, provided a warm and complete welcome. A formal procession was held. Ma Huan notes the sounds, local musicians playing coconut shell guitars and flutes of red wood. The Chinese were honored. Again, the ritual was enacted. The bolts of blue and white patterned silk and the chests of jing porcelain were presented to the king. In return, the king of Malindi offered the products of his own land. The manifests from this voyage are extraordinary. They list incense, like frankincense and myrrh, which were highly valued. They list dragon's blood, a red resin, and ambergris, the waxy, precious substance from whales used in perfumes. They list ivory and the horns of the rhinoceros, and then they list the animals. The primary sources record that the delegation from Malindi offered the Emperor of China a creature that the Chinese had only read about in myth. They called it a kilin. In Chinese legend, the qilin was a gentle, auspicious beast, a sign of a wise and benevolent ruler, a physical manifestation of the mandate of heaven. When we read Ma Huan's description of this animal, we recognize it immediately. He writes of a creature with a body like a deer, but with leopard-like spots. He notes its neck is long, rising to more than 15 feet. It was, of course, a giraffe. We must pause and imagine the mundane, logistical challenge. A giraffe, perhaps two, and other animals. Ma Huan also mentions striped asses, or zebras, and lions had to be loaded onto the horse ships. Pens would have been specially constructed. Slings would have been rigged. The animals would have to be fed and watered for a sea journey that would last for months. The logistics of this task speak to the incredible capability and resources of the fleet. These animals, especially the qilin, were more valuable than any amount of spice or silver. They were living, breathing proof of the virtue of the Mongol emperor. When the fleet returned to Nanjing in 1415, the arrival of these emissaries from Malindi, leading their giraffe, caused a sensation at court. The court painters captured the moment on silk scrolls that survive to this day, showing the giraffe with its gentle eyes being presented to a pleased emperor. The mission's goal, to have the world come to China, was fulfilled in the most spectacular way. The voyages continued. A fifth and sixth expedition consolidated these routes, repairing diplomatic ties and continuing the process of exchange. The fleet was a constant, predictable, and peaceful presence in the Indian Ocean. But this entire grand enterprise, this projection of soft power, was wholly dependent on the vision and the treasury of one man, the Mongol emperor. In 1424, while on a military campaign, the emperor died. His son, the Hongxi emperor, took the throne. When we examine the court records from this period, we see an immediate and decisive shift in policy. The Hongxi emperor was a man of a different temperament. He was a fiscal conservative, and he was a Confucian scholar. His advisors were not adventurers and eunuchs like Zheng He, but pragmatic, inward-looking mandarins. To these new officials, the treasure fleet was an object of profound and unnecessary extravagance. They saw it as a massive drain on the state's treasury. They argued that the true strength of China was not in sailing to distant lands to collect curiosities, but in maintaining internal harmony, securing the northern borders, and repairing the nation's core infrastructure, like the Grand Canal. The historical record is clear. One of the Hongxi emperor's very first edicts was the immediate cessation of all treasure voyages. The order was not a debate, it was an administrative decree. The manifests were filed, the ledgers were closed, the great ships were ordered to be laid up in the harbors, and the construction of new Baoquan was halted. The era, it seemed, was over. The Hongxi emperor reigned for less than a year, but his policies were continued by his son, the Xuande emperor. For 7 years, the fleet remained at anchor. The hulls, once soaked in the waters of the Indian Ocean, began to dry and crack. The red silk sails were stored away. Then, in 1431, the Xuande emperor, perhaps feeling a flush of his grandfather's ambition, or perhaps simply wishing to inform the world of his new reign, authorized one last, final voyage. The order was given to find the old admiral, Zheng He, now in his 60s, and serving as a military commander in Nanjing. He was to reassemble the crews, repair the ships, and sail one last time. This seventh voyage had a different feel. It was not a voyage of discovery. It was a voyage of conclusion. Its purpose was to re-establish the formal ties, to present the new emperor's credentials, and, in a way, to say farewell. Zheng He, the old admiral, began the meticulous, logistical work of bringing his fleet back to life. But before he set sail, he did something new. He, along with his translator, Ma Huan, and other leaders, commissioned 2 stone tablets to be erected in the temples of Chengdu, in Fujian province, the port from which they always departed. These inscriptions were his final testament. These two tablets, erected in 1431, are perhaps the most important primary sources we have for the voyages. They are Zheng He's own voice, carved in stone, a summary of his life's work, offered as a testament of gratitude to Tian Fei, the celestial consort, the goddess of the sea. When we read the translated text of the Chang'e inscription, the tone is not one of arrogance. It is one of profound methodical accomplishment and deep relief. The admiral begins by listing the achievements of the emperor, and then he lists his own. He writes, "We, at the beginning of the Yongle period, received the imperial commission as principal envoys. From that time until now, we have 7 times been sent to the countries of the Western Ocean." He then lists the places they have been, a long rolling list of names. Champa, Java, Calicut, Hormuz, Aden, Mogadishu. The list itself, read aloud, is a kind of low, rhythmic chant, a map of their progress. He speaks of the challenges, but in a calm, filtered way. He writes, "We have traversed more than 100,000 li of water spaces and have beheld in the ocean huge waves like mountains rising in the sky." He does not speak of fear, but of observation. He notes they encountered hidden rocks and barbarian pirates, but frames it all as something they safely passed, thanks to a higher protection. The inscription continues, "We have received the favor of a gracious defense and protection from the divine spirits. The dangers of the way were thus quieted." This stone, then, is an offering of thanks for a career of safe passages. And finally, he summarizes the imperial mandate, the core mission, just as we have understood it. He writes that they were sent to confer presents on them of silks and brocades in order to manifest the transforming power of the imperial virtue. The goal was not conquest, but a gentle transformation, an invitation to join the civilized world. Having left this permanent record, this stone summary of his life, the old admiral boarded his flagship. The fleet sailed for the 7th and final time. The journey was a success, in that it achieved all its logistical and diplomatic goals. The ships revisited Champa, Java, Hormuz, and Calicut. Emissaries were exchanged. The trade ledgers were filled one last time. The Keelan, the giraffe, from the earlier voyage was so well remembered that the fleet once again stopped at Malindi to acquire another, along with more zebras and lions. But for Admiral Zheng He, this was a final passage. The historical records are sparse, but clear on one point. In 1433, on the return leg of the journey, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, likely near Calicut, where he had spent so much of his life, the admiral died. He was in his 60s. His body, in accordance with the traditions of the sea, was committed to the waters. A cenotaph, or empty tomb, was built for him in Nanjing, where it still stands, but his true resting place is the ocean he navigated. The fleet returned home without him. They sailed up the Yangtze to Nanjing in 1433, presented their tribute, their animals, and their balanced ledgers to the Xuandi emperor. And then the order came. This time, it was final. The political climate in the Ming court had changed irreversibly. The Confucian mandarins, who had always viewed the voyages as a costly and dangerous distraction, were now in complete control of policy. An edict was issued. The voyages were to cease. This was not a dramatic ending. There was no great battle, no final storm. It was an administrative decision. The ships were to be broken up. The Great Biography, the 9-masted treasure ships, were pulled into the shipyards and dismantled. Their timbers, the massive logs of teak and camphor, were salvaged and used for other, more practical projects, like public buildings and barges for the Grand Canal. The records, the meticulously kept logs and needle path charts, were filed away. Some later historians claim they were deliberately destroyed by court officials who feared a future emperor might be tempted to repeat the extravagance. Whether by neglect or by design, the knowledge was lost. Within a generation, the ability to build such ships and the knowledge of the routes they sailed faded. China's grand experiment with maritime power, a period of open, peaceful, and massive global engagement, came to a quiet, deliberate close. The empire turned inward, focusing on its great land borders, on agriculture, and on its own internal culture. The sound of the mallets in the shipyards fell silent. The ships themselves are gone, returned to the wood and water from which they came. The great admiral's journey is complete. The ledgers are closed, the manifests are archived, and the ocean is quiet once more. All that remains is the sound of the wind and the sea.